The world called it Baphomet, the church called it a demon, but the evidence suggests they were hiding the face of God. Paris, March 18, 1314, the Ile des Juifs. The air smells of sulphurs and burning wood. 2 men are tied to the stake, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and beside him, a man history often forgets, Geoffroi de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. We know how they died. We know they burned protesting their innocence. But historians have always focused on their words. We should have been focusing on their possessions, because when Geoffroi de Charny burned, he left behind a family, a widow, a son, and he left behind a secret, an object so controversial, so dangerous, and so powerful, that it would become the most studied artifact in human history. For 700 years, the world has looked at the Shroud of Turin and asked, is this the face of God? But for the Templar investigation, that is the wrong question. The right question is, where was it hiding for the 150 years before it appeared? Because when the shroud suddenly emerges in historical records in the 1350s, it is not in a cathedral, it is not in Rome. It is in the hands of a poor French knight, a knight named Geoffroi de Charny II, the nephew of the man who burned at the stake for the Templar order. This is not a coincidence. In the world of intelligence, there are no coincidences of that magnitude. There are only chains of custody. The Templars were accused of worshipping a mysterious bearded head. They called it Baphomet. The church called it a demon. But what if it was neither? What if the idol that destroyed the order was actually the burial cloth of Christ? And what if the Templars didn't just protect it, but died to keep it hidden? Welcome to the file that connects the fire to the face. To understand the object, we must first understand the crime. When King Philip IV arrested the Templars in 1307, the charges were specific and strange. Among the accusations of sodomy and heresy, one charge stood out. Item 47 of the Inquisition articles. That in all the provinces they had idols, that is to say, heads. The inquisitors were obsessed with this head. Under torture, knights gave terrifying, conflicting descriptions. Some said it was a skull covered in skin, some said it was made of wood, some said it had 3 faces. But the majority agreed on one detail. It was the head of a bearded man, terrifying, pale. Some said its eyes seemed to glow. They claimed the head could save them, that it could make the trees bloom and make the land fertile. The church seized on this. They named it Baphomet. They painted it as a demon, a pagan idol worshipped by men who had lost their way in the East. But look at the transcripts closely. The knights rarely described a statue. They described something they were shown only on feast days, something kept in a box or a shrine, something they were told to venerate. Now, apply forensic logic. The Templars were a military order of monks. They were fanatical Christians. They lived and died for the cross. Why would thousands of them suddenly start worshipping a random demon? It makes no psychological sense, but if they possessed the most holy relic in Christendom, the actual burial shroud of Jesus, and if they kept it secret, then the veneration makes perfect sense. They weren't worshipping a demon, they were worshipping the face of their master. It must be said clearly, this interpretation is not accepted by mainstream medieval scholarship. There is no surviving document that explicitly states the Templars possessed the shroud. What exists instead is a convergence, testimony, accusation, disappearance, and reappearance, a pattern that suggests the head was not a monster, but a misunderstood glimpse of something holy. But there is a physical problem. The Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot-long cloth. It shows a full body, front and back. The Templars were accused of worshipping a head, not a body. For centuries, this discrepancy protected the secret, until someone tried to fold a napkin. The shroud is linen, 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. It is unwieldy. You cannot easily display a 14-foot cloth in a secret chapter meeting. You cannot travel with it easily. But there is an ancient way of storing such cloths. The Greeks called it Tetradiplon. Folded 4 times. References to the Tetradiplon appear in Byzantine inventories as early as the 10th century. The famous Mandilion of Edessa was described not as a full body cloth, but as a facial image not made by human hands. That description only makes sense if the cloth was folded to hide the body. If you take the Shroud of Turin and fold it in half, then in half again, and create a specific folding pattern, the body disappears. The bloodstains on the chest disappear, the scourging marks on the back disappear. Only one thing remains visible: the face, framed in a rectangle, looking out horizontally, disembodied, bearded, pale. If you put this folded cloth inside a frame or a reliquary box with an opening, what do you see? You see a bearded head. You see exactly what the Templars were accused of worshipping. This solves the visual anomaly, but it does not solve the timeline. To prove the Templars had it, we have to prove they could have taken it. And for that, we must go to the crime scene of the century, Constantinople, 1204. Before 1204, the shroud was not a myth. It was a documented asset of the Byzantine Empire. They called it the Mandilion, or the Sindon. It was kept in the imperial palace in Constantinople. Every Friday it was raised up so the faithful could see the face of God. Then came the Fourth Crusade, a crusade that went wrong. Instead of attacking Jerusalem, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople. Christian attacking Christian. It was a sack, a looting spree of epic proportions. The city was stripped bare: gold, silver, statues, relics. A French knight named Robert de Clary wrote a chronicle of that time. He specifically mentions the shroud. He says, "There was a shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday, so that the figure of our Lord could be plainly seen there." And then he writes the most important sentence in the history of the relic. "And no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of this shroud when the city was taken." The Templars were uniquely positioned. They were not looters, they were custodians. Their role was to secure valuables, not display them. In chaos, custodians become invisible. The Knights Templar were there. They were the bankers of the crusade. They took custody of valuables as collateral for loans. And after 1204, the Templars enter their golden age of wealth and power in Europe. For 100 years, the shroud is missing from history. Historians call this the missing century, but it wasn't missing, it was secure. In the vaults of the only organization powerful enough to keep the Vatican from seizing it. Now we fast forward, past the glory, past the arrests, past the fire of 1314. The Templars are destroyed. Jacques de Molay is dead. Geoffroi de Charny is dead. We move to the year 1357. A small village in France called Lire, a small wooden church. A local nobleman decides to hold an exhibition. He displays a cloth. He claims it is the true burial shroud of Christ. Crowds flock to see it. Pilgrims bring coins. It is a sensation. But who is this nobleman? Who is the man who suddenly possesses an object that emperors and popes have searched for? His name is Geoffroi de Charny II. He is the nephew, or son, of the Templar preceptor burned in Paris. This is the smoking gun. The shroud did not appear in the hands of a king. It did not appear in the hands of a bishop. It appeared in the hands of the direct heir of the Templar leadership. And there is more. Geoffroi de Charny II was a knight, the definition of chivalry. He wrote the book on knightly conduct. He was the standard bearer of France. He was not a con man. He was a man of honor. He never explained where he got the cloth. He never claimed he found it in the East. He simply had it. Why would a family keep such a secret? Think about the date, 1350s. Only 40 years after the Templars were hunted down. To admit you had the Templar idol, to admit you were holding Templar assets, was a death sentence. It would prove the accusations were true. It would prove the heresy was real. So the de Charny family did the only thing they could. They displayed the object. But they hid the source. They let people call it a relic. But they never whispered the word Templar. The local bishop, Henri de Poitiers, was furious. He tried to stop the exhibition. He claimed the cloth was a painting. But the de Charny family ignored him. Why? Because they knew what they had. And they knew that the bishop had no idea what he was looking at. We must address the elephant in the room: science. In 1988, the Vatican allowed 3 laboratories to test the shroud using radiocarbon dating: Arizona, Oxford, Zurich. The world waited. The results came back with 95% confidence. The flax used to weave the linen was harvested between 1260 and 1390. For the faithful, this was a disaster. It meant the cloth was a medieval fake. But for the Templar theory, look at the dates again, 1260 to 1390. This is the exact window of the Templar fall. It covers the arrest, 1307. It covers the execution, 1314. It covers the exhibition in Lire, 1357. If the carbon 14 is correct, it doesn't disprove the Templar connection, it strengthens it. Many experts argue the 1988 test was flawed. They point to the location of the sample, a corner of the cloth handled by thousands of people, a corner repaired by nuns after a fire in 1532. They argue the sample was a mix of ancient linen and medieval cotton repair threads. But let us play the devil's advocate. Let us assume the carbon-14 date is correct. Let us assume the image was created in the 13th century. This leads to a darker possibility, a possibility whispered by fringe historians. If the shroud is medieval, and if it depicts a bearded man who has been tortured, beaten, and crucified, and if it was in the possession of the Templars, who is the man on the cloth? The script of the Passion of Christ was well known. The Templars were accused of mocking the cross, of strange initiation rituals. Is it possible that the image on the shroud is not Jesus, but Jacques de Molay? The theory is disturbing. It suggests that during the torture of the Grand Master, or perhaps as a final act of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, Molay was tortured in a way that mimicked the crucifixion. His body, wrapped in a cloth, left the imprint that the de Charny family later preserved. Forensic pathologists who have studied the shroud claim the body shows signs of trauma consistent with medieval torture methods, not just Roman ones. The swollen face, the specific muscle contractions. Is the shroud a photograph of a murder? A medieval negative created by sweat, blood, and aloes on linen? Whether it is Christ or the Grand Master, the face you see on that cloth is the face that the Templars gazed upon. For 700 years, the narrative was that the Church hunted the Templars because they were heretics, because they had abandoned God. But in 2001, a researcher named Barbara Frail found a document misfiled in the Vatican secret archives. It had been lost since the 17th century, the Chinon Parchment. This document changed history. It records the interrogation of the Templar leadership by the Pope's own emissaries in 1308, before the fire, before the end. And the conclusion of the Pope was shocking. He absolved them. Pope Clement V formally absolved Jacques de Molay and the leadership of heresy. He found that their strange rituals, spitting on the cross, kissing, worshipping a head, were not acts of devil worship. They were initiation trials, military hazing, or misunderstood veneration. In modern legal terms, the Pope cleared them of the very crime used to justify their execution. The Pope knew the secret. He knew they were holding something. The document proves that the head was not a demon. The Pope writes that the Templars sought absolution for their strange forms of veneration. He granted it. But he never released the document. Why? Because the King of France had the army. The Pope had the truth. But the King had the swords. And in the Middle Ages, swords vote louder than truth. Clement V buried the parchment. He let the Templars burn to save his own position. And the secret of the head was buried with them. The shroud eventually left the de Charny family. It was sold to the House of Savoy. It became the prize of kings. It survived fires. It survived wars. It sits today in Turin, Italy, still silent, still watching, but trace the bloodline. The de Charny family died out in the male line, but the blood survived through the female line, and that bloodline married into the families that would later become key figures in the European nobility. Some genealogists claim connections to the Sinclair family in Scotland, the same Sinclairs of Rosslyn Chapel, the same Sinclairs linked to the voyage to America. It always comes back to the same network, the same families guarding the same echoes. Consider the psychological impact. If the Templars possessed the shroud, they held the physical evidence of the resurrection, or at the very least, the most potent symbol of divine authority on earth. Possessing it meant you didn't need the Pope to interpret God for you. You had the receipts. This fits perfectly with the Templar attitude: arrogant, independent, secretive. They didn't fear the Church because they believed they were closer to the source than the Church was. When you look at the Shroud of Turin today, You are not just looking at a religious icon. You are looking at the reason the Templars had to die, a secret that was too big for any one order to hold. What is a relic? Is it a magical object, or is it leverage? For the Knights Templar, the bearded head was the center of their inner circle. It was the focus of their devotion, and ultimately, it was the evidence used to destroy them. They were accused of worshipping an idol. They were likely worshipping the image of Christ. The irony is absolute. They were burned as heretics for possessing the ultimate proof of faith. The shroud remains an anomaly. Science cannot fully explain how the image was formed. History cannot fully explain where it was between 1204 and 1357. The only bridge across that gap is the temple. Did they find it in Constantinople? Did they hide it in France? Did they die protecting it? And did the family of the martyr Geoffroi de Charny reveal it to the world only when the danger had passed? The timeline fits, the location fits, the description fits, the silence fits. The Templars are gone. But the face they watched never left history. This is the Templar Files. We are just getting started.